In this episode, we're going to focus on a type of access that often feels normal and harmless until it becomes the easiest path into the cardholder data environment: CDE vendor and support access. Most organizations rely on outside help in some form. Whether it is a payment application provider, a managed service team, a point-of-sale vendor, a hosting partner, or a specialist who troubleshoots issues after hours. That support can be valuable and necessary, but it also creates a unique risk because it blends high privilege, remote connectivity, and shared responsibility. Vendors often need powerful access to fix problems quickly, and internal teams often want that access to be always available so they can restore service fast. Attackers love this situation because it creates accounts that are hard to monitor, hard to retire, and sometimes shared across multiple people. Guardrails are how you keep vendor access from turning into a permanent backdoor. For a beginner, the mindset shift is simple. Vendor access is not a one-time setup task. It is a living risk that must be managed continuously with identity discipline, purpose limits, monitoring, and clean offboarding. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding why vendor access behaves differently from employee access. With employees, an organization usually has direct control over hiring, identity proofing, device management, training, and enforcement of policy. With vendors, you are depending on another organization's processes, and you may not know how strong they are. A vendor may have strong controls, or they may have weak ones, and either way you have to assume that the vendor is a different security domain than yours. That means you cannot treat a vendor account as a trusted internal identity. You need compensating controls that reduce how much that account can do and increase how visible its actions are. Another difference is that vendor access is often episodic. It may be used only during outages, major updates, or monthly maintenance windows. Episodic access is dangerous because people forget the details, permissions creep over time, and review cycles are easily skipped. The guardrails you build should not depend on constant human attention. They should be part of the access design so that even if people are busy, the access remains bounded. A QSA validating vendor access is looking for evidence that those boundaries exist and are enforced. The first guardrail is individual accountability, meaning vendor access should be tied to a specific person, not a generic shared credential. Shared vendor accounts are one of the most common weak patterns because they erase attribution. If multiple vendor technicians can use the same login and something goes wrong, nobody can reliably say who did what. That makes investigations harder and reduces deterrence. It also increases the chance that credentials are mishandled because nobody feels personally responsible. For beginners, it helps to see accountability as the foundation of trust. You are not trusting the vendor blindly. You are trusting that actions can be traced to individuals and reviewed. This becomes especially important when vendor access reaches systems that store or process sensitive data. When a QSA asks about vendor access, they are often testing whether the environment can link a vendor session to a named individual, an approved request, and a documented outcome. If the organization cannot do that, the access is likely uncontrolled, even if the connection method uses strong authentication. The second guardrail is least privilege with purpose limits, which means vendor accounts should have only the access needed for their specific support duties, and that access should not automatically include broad administrative reach. Vendors sometimes request wide permissions because it makes troubleshooting faster, but speed without boundaries is how environments accumulate long-term risk. A healthy pattern is to give vendors a controlled entry point and controlled destinations, such as access to specific systems and functions rather than the entire network. Purpose limits also mean there should be clarity about what the vendor is allowed to do, not just what they can technically do. For example, a vendor might be allowed to view configuration settings and apply approved updates, but not allowed to create new accounts, modify logging configurations, or move data out of the environment. Those restrictions should be reinforced by technical controls where possible and by monitoring and review where technical restriction is not feasible. From a validation perspective, A QSA is looking for the story of why the vendor needs access, what exactly they can access, and how the organization prevents that access from becoming broader over time. Another essential guardrail is time-bounded access, because permanent access is almost always a liability. Permanent access tends to drift, and drift is exactly what attackers exploit. Time-bounded access means vendor accounts are enabled only when needed and disabled when not needed. This can be done in different ways, but the concept is stable. Access should not be standing open just in case. For a beginner, think of it like leaving a door unlocked overnight because you might have a late delivery. Even if the delivery is legitimate, you have increased risk for many hours with no benefit. In payment environments, time-bounding vendor access reduces the window of opportunity for credential theft and unauthorized use. It also forces the organization to have a repeatable request and approval routine, which strengthens accountability. A QSA will often ask for examples. Show a recent instance where vendor access was enabled for a support event. Show who approved it. Show when it was disabled, and show what was done during the session. Those examples are often more revealing than policy statements. Guardrails also include controlled pathways, meaning vendor access should not occur through random direct connections into sensitive systems. Instead, it should be funneled through a small number of approved entry points that are monitored and hardened. The reason is simple. The fewer ways into the environment, the easier it is to defend and observe. If vendors connect directly to many different systems in many different ways, you create a complex map that is hard to inventory and hard to validate. Complexity is a breeding ground for forgotten accounts, overlooked network paths, and inconsistent monitoring. When vendor access is centralized through approved pathways, the organization can apply consistent authentication requirements, consistent logging, and consistent session controls. It also makes it easier to enforce separation between environments, such as ensuring vendors do not jump from a support session into unrelated systems. For new learners, the key takeaway is that access architecture is part of security. Guardrails are not only rules, they are built into the environment's layout. Monitoring is another guardrail that becomes essential because vendors often have elevated privileges, and elevated privileges demand higher visibility. Monitoring does not mean spying. It means being able to reconstruct actions and detect abuse. At a minimum, the organization should be able to identify when a vendor session occurred, which account was used, from where the connection originated, and what systems were accessed. Ideally, the organization can also review changes made during the session, especially changes to configurations, access controls, and payment-related components. The purpose of monitoring is twofold. First, it deters misuse because people are less likely to take inappropriate actions when they know actions are recorded. Second, it supports investigation and troubleshooting if something breaks or if suspicious activity is detected. A QSA validating vendor access will look for evidence that logs exist and that someone reviews them or can produce them quickly when asked. If vendor sessions are effectively invisible, then the environment is relying on trust without verification, and that is not a strong posture for payment systems. Another common weak link is poor offboarding, which is what happens when vendor relationships change but access does not. Contracts end, vendors get replaced, employees at the vendor leave, and support responsibilities shift. If access remains, you end up with dormant accounts that nobody remembers and nobody monitors. Dormant accounts are dangerous because they can be reactivated quietly or compromised without immediate detection. Offboarding should be treated as a normal part of vendor management, not as an exceptional cleanup task. The organization should know which vendors have access, which accounts exist, what those accounts can do, and when they were last used. When a vendor is no longer needed, access should be removed promptly and in a verified way. For a beginner, this is where inventory thinking becomes important. You cannot remove what you cannot enumerate. A QSA will often test offboarding maturity by asking for the list of vendor access accounts, and then asking for evidence of periodic review and removal. If the list is incomplete or outdated, it suggests the environment has hidden backdoors. Shared responsibility is also a guardrail topic because vendors and customers often assume the other party is handling critical controls. The vendor might assume the customer reviews access logs, and the customer might assume the vendor enforces strong identity controls. The result can be a gap where nobody is doing something that everyone assumes is done. In PCI assessments, shared responsibility needs to be explicit. That means roles, tasks, and expectations should be documented and understood, including who approves access, who monitors sessions, who rotates credentials when people change, and who responds when suspicious activity is detected. For a new learner, the key is that clarity prevents gaps. Gaps are what create weak links. When a QSA evaluates vendor access, they are not only checking technical controls, but also evaluating whether the organization can articulate the responsibility split. If nobody can explain who owns which part of the access lifecycle, it is likely that guardrails exist only partially or informally. As we wrap up, remember that vendor and support access is not inherently bad, but it is inherently risky because it combines outside identity, high privilege, and often remote connectivity into one package. Guardrails turn that risk into a controlled capability by enforcing individual accountability, least privilege, time-bounded access, controlled pathways, strong monitoring, and clean offboarding. The goal is not to make support impossible. It is to make support safe and auditable. For a PCI QSA, validation is about evidence that these guardrails operate in real life, especially during the stressful moments when support is actually needed. If the organization can show that vendor access is requested, approved, enabled, monitored, and disabled consistently, and that accounts are reviewed and removed when relationships end, then vendor access stops being the weakest link. It becomes a managed part of the environment that supports business continuity without sacrificing control of the CDE. That is what it looks like to treat vendor access like a disciplined security domain, not like an informal convenience.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.